You think someone like you has any right to touch this car? Celeste Harrington said it loudly enough that the entire showroom fell silent. In front of dozens of wealthy guests, she snatched the cleaning cloth out of the hands of Maren Holloway, a 28-year-old single mother working the evening shift, and tipped a glass of red wine down the front of her worn uniform. When Celeste shoved her backward, the bracelet of colored plastic beads on Maren's wrist snapped. The small beads, each one lettered to spell MOM, scattered across the polished stone floor. It had been a birthday gift, strung by hand by her 6-year-old daughter, with the money she had saved in a piggy bank. Maren knelt and began picking them up one by one, her hands shaking, and she did not say a word in her own defense. She needed this job to pay for her daughter's surgery, even as Celeste called her the kind of poor woman who latches onto rich men, and ordered the manager to have her removed from the building. Nobody spoke up, but just as 2 security officers stepped forward, the glass doors behind them opened. Rafe Castellano, the most powerful man in Pittsburgh and Celeste's own fiancé, stood there in a black suit, his cold gray eyes settling first on the wine stain across Maren's chest, then on the beads scattered at her feet. Celeste smiled at once, certain he had come to take her side. She took his arm and told him that woman had just embarrassed their family showroom. Rafe did not look at his fiancée once. He walked to where Maren knelt, bent down, and picked up the bead marked with the letter M, then turned to face the room. 7 years ago, someone shot out my tire, and my car went into the river on a night of heavy snow, he said, very quietly. 12 people stood on that bridge and watched. Only one of them went in after me. Celeste went pale. Rafe took off his coat, laid it over Maren's shoulders, and spoke in a voice that turned the whole room cold. The woman you just humiliated is the reason I'm alive. But there was one thing nobody in that room knew. Maren had recognized him the moment he walked through the door, and for 7 years she had been holding on to something she prayed he would never ask her about, because if she said it out loud tonight, far more than a wedding was going to come apart. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we know you stayed with Maren until the very end. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness is never wasted. And don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss the stories still to come. Not a single clap broke the silence. In that vast showroom, the only sound was that of a wine glass being set down on a stone tabletop, softly, almost timidly, as though even the person holding it feared they had just made too much noise at a funeral. After the sound of that glass came silence. It wasn't the silence of respect, but the silence of 30 people who had just realized that for the past half hour, they had stood by and watched something they should have stopped, and now it was too late to pretend they had merely happened to be passing through. Gerald Pike, the man who only minutes earlier had been so quick to signal for security, took half a step back and lowered his eyes to the stone floor. The 2 security guards remained rooted exactly where they stood, neither daring to move forward nor to retreat, because the order they had just received and the man now standing before them belonged to 2 entirely different worlds. Several guests began raising their phones, slowly and discreetly, in the way people did when they knew for certain that whatever they were recording would be worth something by morning. Celeste was still clutching Rafe's sleeve. She didn't let go, perhaps because it was the last point of support remaining in a room that had suddenly turned its back on her as one. Rafe looked down at that hand, then he removed it. He didn't yank it away, didn't knock it aside, didn't make a single movement that could be called forceful. He simply lifted her fingers from the fabric of his jacket, one by one, with a slowness so cruel that it was precisely that deliberateness that sent an icy chill down Celeste's spine. She would rather have had him shout in her face. Her voice broke, stripped of every trace of the woman who had just stood in the middle of the room ordering others around. She asked whether he knew whom he was humiliating in front of all these people. She invoked her father. She invoked the Harrington name. She spoke of the wedding only 3 weeks away, of the handshakes whose ink had barely dried, of everything she thought might pull him back to her side. Rafe listened to it all. He didn't interrupt her once, and when she had finished, he answered in a voice even quieter than before, saying that he knew exactly whom he was humiliating. Celeste couldn't find another word to say. 3 years beside this man had taught her something very few people in Pittsburgh knew. The angrier Rafe Castellano became, the lower his voice fell. And when he spoke so softly that people had to hold their breath to hear him, things had already gone too far to be saved. She let her hand fall, stepped back, and for the first time that evening, she looked around and found not a single gaze willing to meet hers. But while the entire room was watching him, Rafe was thinking about something else entirely. 30 seconds earlier, when he had bent down to pick up the plastic bead engraved with the letter M, the woman kneeling on the floor had reached for it at the same moment he did, and in the instant her left palm turned upward beneath the lights, he saw a long scar running across it, faded by the years but still bearing the raised ridge of a deep cut. And he knew that 7 years earlier, beneath the black waters of the Allegheny River, it was that very hand he had grasped. He had never seen her face clearly. He recognized the hand. Marin was still kneeling on the floor, his coat heavy across her shoulders, and she understood at once what had just happened, because she had seen his gaze linger on her palm 1 beat longer than it should have. She immediately curled her fingers inward to hide it, but it was already too late. 7 years of moving through 3 rented apartments, 7 years of changing her phone number, 7 years of keeping her face out of every photograph, all of it dissolved because a bracelet cord had snapped, and, for one unguarded second, she had reached out and forgotten to think. She closed her palm tightly around those tiny plastic beads, then rose to her feet. The entire room was still watching her, but the only person she cared about now was the man standing 3 paces away, looking at her like someone who had just found what he had spent 7 years searching for, without the slightest idea that it had deliberately spent those same 7 years hiding from him. Rafe took 1 step forward, and the entire room seemed to move with him by the measure of a single breath. He said he would take her home. He said his car was parked right outside, that she didn't need to walk to the bus stop in a uniform soaked with wine in the middle of December, that if she needed anything at all, she only had to say the word, and it would be hers before dawn. It was the promise he had made to others for the past 7 years, and he had never once needed to make it twice to anyone. Marin stood still and listened to everything. Then she reached up to her shoulders, removed his coat, folded it carefully in half with both hands, the way someone folded something temporarily borrowed that they had no right to keep, and held it out to return it to him. He didn't reach for it. She remained exactly as she was, both hands extended across the distance of 3 paces between them, until he was forced to take it. She thanked him. She said her shift didn't end until 11 o'clock, that she still had 2 display rooms in the back to finish cleaning, and that they paid her by the shift, not by pity. Someone among the guests let out a quiet laugh, then abruptly smothered it halfway through, because no one was certain whether they were allowed to laugh. Gerald Pike opened his mouth, about to tell her she might as well go home for the night. But when he saw the look in Rafe's eyes, he closed it again. Rafe stared at the woman standing before him for a long time. He had stood face to face with men holding knives, men holding contracts, men who smiled as they made threats, and he had never had any difficulty reading what they wanted. But he couldn't read this woman. His voice dropping lower, he asked whether she knew who he was. In Pittsburgh, that was a question that usually needed to be asked only once. Marin raised her head and looked directly into his eyes, and it was the first time all evening that she had looked directly into anyone's eyes. She said she had known who he was for 7 years, and the only thing she had wanted throughout those 7 years was for him never to remember her. No one in the room understood what those words meant, but they all heard that it wasn't gratitude, nor was it reproach, but something heavier than either. The kind of thing a person said only after carrying it through their thoughts for far too many years. Standing a few paces away, Celeste felt a chill run down the back of her neck, one she couldn't put a name to. Rafe didn't answer, perhaps because, for the first time in a very long while, he didn't know how. Marin bent down and picked up the cleaning cloth Celeste had torn from her hand earlier, still lying crumpled across the stone floor. She dusted it off twice, then draped it over her arm. She quietly told Gerald Pike that she would finish cleaning this area before moving on to the other one, and he nodded like a machine. She walked around the gathered guests. They automatically parted to either side to let her pass. The very same people who only minutes earlier had stood watching her kneel on the floor without a single one of them moving. She didn't look at any of them. She walked straight toward the small door in the corner of the room, the door reserved for employees, and throughout that short journey, her left hand remained clenched tightly around the plastic beads, so tightly that their small edges pressed into the exact place where the old scar lay. The door closed behind her, very softly, without a single unnecessary sound. In the showroom, people began talking again, tentatively at first, then gradually louder, the way crowds always did when trying to cover over what had just happened before their eyes. Celeste called Rafe's name twice. He didn't turn around. He remained exactly where he was, surrounded by gleaming cars worth more than a working person might earn in an entire lifetime. His left hand holding the coat she had carefully folded, his right hand loosely closed. He opened his right palm. Resting in its center was a small plastic bead, its blue color faded, the letter M engraved upon it, the one he had picked up and forgotten to return. And Rafe Castellano, the man whose name made an entire city lower its voice, stood there in the showroom as the noise rose around him once more, staring at a child's plastic bead in the palm of his hand and not knowing what to do with it. Marin arrived home close to midnight, 40 minutes later than usual, because she had cleaned both display rooms in the back exactly as she had promised, without leaving a single square foot untouched, even though no one remained to inspect her work. Mrs. Ada Buchanan opened the door of the apartment across the hall when she heard Marin's footsteps reach the third-floor landing, holding the hand of Poppy, whose eyes were drooping with sleep, and she didn't ask why a dark stain had spread across the front of Marin's uniform. She only said the little girl had finished her entire bowl of soup and had already brushed her teeth, then closed the door again. Poppy rubbed her eyes, wrapped her arms around her mother's leg, and immediately, with that peculiar instinct children possessed for anything they had made with their own hands, took hold of Marin's left wrist. She felt around it, then looked up and asked where Mommy's bracelet had gone. Marin bent down, lifted her daughter into her arms, and said the cord had come loose while Mommy was cleaning a car, but all the beads were still safe in her pocket, and tomorrow she would string them together again, even more beautifully than before. Poppy asked whether any of the beads were missing. Marin said none of them were missing. It was the first lie she told that night, and she said it so calmly that she almost believed it herself. The little girl nodded, rested her head on her mother's shoulder, and fell asleep before Marin had reached the end of the hallway. She laid Poppy in bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and remained there for a while, counting her daughter's breaths, a habit she had carried since Poppy was 6 months old, and the doctor had first said the words, birth defect, a habit Marin knew she would never be able to break. Then she went into the kitchen and switched on the small lamp above the table. There, arranged in a neat stack, were the things she had avoided looking at for the past 3 days. On top was the letter from the insurance company, a single page, 11 lines, ending with the word denied, and a telephone number for appeals that she had called 4 times, without once reaching a real person. Beneath it was the hospital's estimated cost statement, and on the final line was the figure $62,000, printed in bold, as though they were afraid the person reading it might somehow fail to see. At the bottom was the surgery appointment notice, with the original date crossed out once, and a new date written over it in ballpoint pen, only for that date to be crossed out as well. The second postponement. The doctor had explained very gently that the surgery to repair the opening in her heart wasn't considered an emergency, that the little girl remained stable, that they could wait. But he had also said, just as gently, that the longer they waited, the harder that heart would have to work beyond what it could endure, and that he didn't advise her to wait past spring. Marin reached for the tin cookie box on top of the cabinet. She emptied everything onto the table and began to count. Tips from the diner where she worked the morning shift, wages from extra cleaning jobs on weekends, crumpled $1, $5, and $10 bills smoothed flat and arranged in small stacks. She counted twice to be certain. $4,120 in 7 months. She sat staring at that amount, then at the bold figure of $62,000 printed on the paper beside it, and performed the subtraction in her head, the same subtraction she had done so many times that she no longer needed paper or a pen. She was still $58,000 short. At this rate, she would have enough money sometime around the time Poppy graduated from high school. She didn't cry. She had moved beyond crying a long time ago, back when the little girl hadn't yet learned to walk, back when Marin was still trying to call a disconnected number belonging to the man who had vanished the very week he learned she was pregnant, the man she had never tried to find again. She simply sat there with both hands resting on the table, then opened her left palm. The tiny plastic beads were still there, their shapes pressed red into her flesh throughout the entire journey home. She counted them, then counted them again. 1 bead was missing, and she knew exactly whose palm that missing bead was resting in. That same night, on the other side of the city, Enzo Rinaldi entered Rafe's office close to 1 o'clock in the morning and found his boss still sitting exactly where he had been, the coat folded in half on the desk before him, neither hung up nor touched. Enzo had followed this man for 11 years. He had seen him sit in silence like this before 3 purges and 2 brushes with death, and he knew which silence belonged to calculation and which belonged to something else. This was something else. He placed the thin file on the desk and began his report. Rafe didn't let him finish. He interrupted with a single question, his voice still as quiet as it had been all evening, asking who had brought her into the showroom, and when. Enzo turned to the second page. He said the woman had never appeared on the Castellano payroll, and there was no employment contract bearing her name at any company owned by the family. She worked for an outside cleaning contractor, one of 4 firms hired by the administrative department to clean the group's properties. And she had been with them for nearly 4 years, sent all over the city from office buildings to warehouses to underground parking garages. 3 months earlier, the company had found itself short-staffed, and she had been reassigned to the showroom on Ellsworth Avenue. Enzo paused for a moment, then continued, saying that she had applied twice for a transfer to another work location, and both requests had been denied because of staffing needs. Neither application had given a specific reason. Her shift ended at 7 o'clock in the evening, an hour and a half before the party began, and by all rights she should have been home long before tonight's gathering. She had stayed because the manager called her in for overtime when guests arrived. Rafe listened to everything without asking another question, and Enzo understood that his boss had heard the same thing he himself had recognized upon reaching the second line of the report. The woman had done everything she could to avoid standing inside a building that bore the Castellano name, and she had lost that struggle only because the company was short on workers and she was short on money. Rafe opened the bottom drawer on the left side of his desk. There was no gun inside it, no money, no documents. There was only a small cloth bag, and inside that bag was a faded gray wool glove, torn at the tips of the index and middle fingers. A single glove without its mate. He placed it on the desk beside the folded coat. 7 years earlier, when he had awakened in the hospital with 2 broken ribs and 1 lung filled with river water, that glove had been the only thing clutched in his hand. They had been forced to pry his fingers open one by one to take it from him. He had spent 7 years searching for its owner. 3 different investigative teams, each more expensive than the one before it, had all stopped at the same place. Several witnesses on the bridge had seen a young woman climb over the railing, but no one knew her name. No one had captured her face in a photograph, and she appeared in neither hospital records nor the police report. All 3 teams reached the same conclusion, that the woman had deliberately disappeared. Rafe had paid for all 3 conclusions and had never believed any of them until tonight. Enzo remained silent for a long while before asking the question he had no choice but to ask. What about the wedding? It was 3 weeks away. The invitations had been sent. The 2 families had shaken hands in front of 4 other families. Word that Rafe had humiliated Celeste Harrington in the middle of the showroom would reach Weston Harrington before dawn, if it hadn't reached him already. Rafe rested 1 finger against the wool glove, very gently, the way someone might touch something that could break. He said the wedding would still take place. Enzo raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Then Rafe added something else, and this was the sentence that made Enzo lift his head and look directly at his boss. First, he needed to know why the woman who had saved his life had spent 7 years hiding from him. 7 years earlier, on the night of February 14th, the snow fell so heavily that the streetlights on Bellwether Bridge had become nothing more than dim yellow halos suspended in the air. Maren Holloway was 21 then, a second-year nursing student, and she was walking home after a 12-hour clinical shift in the emergency room because her bus money for the month had run out on the 9th. She followed the pedestrian walkway on the left, both hands buried in the pockets of her coat, wearing a pair of gray wool gloves she had bought at a thrift store, and she was thinking about the anatomy exam she had the next morning when she heard the explosion. It wasn't the sound of a tire bursting. She had grown up in a neighborhood where people knew how to tell one kind of noise from another, and what she had just heard was a dry, sharp, decisive blast coming from behind the black car approaching along the bridge. The car swerved. It spun sideways across the snow-covered bridge, sliding for a strangely long distance, almost slowly, before crashing through the railing on the right and disappearing over the edge. The sound of the water rising to meet it wasn't as loud as she had imagined it would be. There was only a muffled crash, and then silence. Traffic stopped on the bridge. Later, when she told the story to herself during sleepless nights, Maren counted 12 people. 12 people stepped out of their cars, walked to the railing, and leaned over to look down. Some cried out. Some took out their phones and held them up. Not one of those 12 people climbed over the railing. Maren stood there with them for exactly 3 seconds. She looked down at the black water below, and saw a faint glow sinking slowly into the darkness. The two headlights still burning beneath the surface, descending deeper and growing dimmer with every passing moment. Those 3 seconds, she would later think, were the only time in her life when she had truly possessed the right to choose. Then she took off her coat, dropped it onto the bridge, climbed onto the railing, and jumped. The water was so cold that her heart seemed to miss a beat, and her chest seized, refusing to open. She had learned enough to understand what was happening to her body, and she also knew she had roughly 3 or 4 minutes before her fingers stopped obeying her. She dove toward the two headlights. The car lay tilted on its side at the bottom, not very deep, perhaps only a little more than 6 feet below the surface, and through the window beside the driver's seat, she saw a man's face, his eyes still open, one hand beating weakly against the glass. The door wouldn't open. She surfaced for air, dove again, and struck the lower corner of the window with her elbow, the weakest point, hitting it 4 times, 5 times, until cracks spread through it, and it burst apart into a mass of jagged shards. When she reached through the broken window frame to find the safety lock, she felt something slice across her left palm, deep and hot. But the freezing water stole the pain from her within seconds. She managed to pull the man out through the shattered window. He weighed nearly twice as much as she did. She wrapped one arm around his chest exactly as she had been taught in water rescue class, then swam on her back toward the rocky bank on the left, kicking her legs 1 stroke at a time, and counting silently in her head so panic wouldn't carry her away. She couldn't remember how long it took. When both knees struck stone, she dragged him another 6 feet beyond the water's edge before collapsing. Then she rolled him onto his side, pushed her fingers into his mouth to clear his airway, pressed hard against his chest, and he coughed up water, coughing in long, violent fits until his body convulsed. He opened his eyes. They were gray, and they were beginning to drift away in a way Marin had seen too many times in the emergency room not to understand what it meant. She cradled his head in both hands, held him tightly, turned his face toward hers, and said, "Don't fall asleep. Look at me. Don't fall asleep." She repeated those words over and over, more times than she could count, until the cold left her throat raw. The man raised one hand, groped blindly through the darkness, and found her left wrist, where the gray wool glove still remained. He gripped it so tightly that his knuckles turned white, as though it were the only thing still holding him on this side. Then she heard sirens echoing from far away, muted by the snow, still several minutes from reaching them. There was one detail Marin had never told anyone, not even herself, on the nights when she allowed herself to remember. 3 seconds before she climbed over the railing, she had looked up. She didn't know why she had done it. Perhaps it was only the instinct of someone about to do something reckless, who wanted to see solid ground one final time. And there, about 50 feet away toward the end of the bridge, standing apart from the 12 people crowding against the railing, was a man alone. He didn't cry out. He didn't take out a phone. He didn't run forward. He simply stood still, with both hands in his coat pockets, his head lowered, as he watched the water with the composure of someone waiting to see whether something he had arranged would unfold exactly as planned. Only when the two headlights beneath the water went completely dark did he turn away. Marin saw that face beneath the streetlight for exactly 1.5 seconds, and her 21-year-old mind, a mind that had just endured a 12-hour shift in the emergency room and was about to plunge into an ice-cold river, captured it with a clarity she would spend the next 7 years wishing it hadn't possessed. 3 days later, while her left hand was still wrapped in bandages and she had only just begun to believe she had escaped the whole thing, someone knocked on the door of her student apartment. She didn't open it. The person outside didn't demand to be let in. He merely spoke through the door in a calm voice, without menace, almost kindly, saying that he knew she had visited the clinic on Craig Street that Tuesday, that she was carrying a child, only 4 weeks along, and that if she remained silent, that child would be allowed to grow up. Then his footsteps receded. There was nothing more, no threat more specific than that. And it was precisely that absence that kept Marin awake for 3 nights, because a specific threat was something a person could take to the police, but a sentence like that wasn't. Later, when she had been given enough time to think, she understood. That man had never intended to harm her. A female nursing student disappearing from the city would bring the press, records, and questions he didn't want anyone asking at that particular time. But a frightened witness, a witness with a small child, a witness who willingly buried herself at the bottom of the city and lived on loose change, was something far more valuable. She was the card he kept hidden in his pocket, An insurance policy in case the day ever came when he needed it. Something he could draw out to control Rafe Castellano if circumstances demanded it. That was why he hadn't lost track of her for a single day in 7 years. And it was also why she had never truly escaped, despite moving through 3 apartments and changing her phone number 3 times. She wasn't hiding from him. She was simply living inside the exact boundary he had drawn for her, and he left her alone as long as she remained within it. Maren stood before the bathroom mirror close to 1 o'clock in the morning and stared at the red wine stain that had dried into a dark brown blotch across the chest of her uniform. She had washed it 3 times in cold water, and it still wouldn't come out. She looked at it for a long while. For 7 years, she had done exactly what had been demanded of her. She had remained silent, kept her head lowered, moved through this city like a nameless shadow. Yet tonight, in the middle of a brightly lit showroom filled with people, a man had stood up and spoken her name aloud, told everyone what she had done, while 30 raised phones recorded every word. By morning, all of Pittsburgh would know, and the man who had stood on the bridge that night would know as well. Her 7 years of silence had just come to an end, and she hadn't even been the one to end it. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the video had been viewed more than 2 million times. It had been recorded from 3 different angles by 3 different guests, and someone had edited the footage together, added background music, and placed a line of text across the screen. In the version shared most widely, Celeste's face was blurred at the request of the Harrington family attorneys only 4 hours after it was posted, but Maren's face wasn't, because no one had hired an attorney for a cleaning woman. By 9 o'clock, someone had discovered her name. By 10 o'clock, someone had found the cleaning company she worked for. Maren learned all of this from the screen of her old phone while sitting on a plastic chair outside the showroom office, where she had been instructed to appear at 10:30 without being given a reason. Gerald Pike called her inside at 11:15. He couldn't bring himself to look her directly in the eyes, and he spent nearly 3 minutes talking in circles before finally reaching the point. He said what had happened the night before wasn't her fault. He repeated that sentence twice, as though saying it enough times might somehow change the outcome. Then he said the cleaning company had received a request from management, that this location had an image to preserve, that now all she had to do was walk into the showroom holding a broom and someone would take out a phone to record her, and that they couldn't allow the situation to continue. He said she would receive her full wages for the week. Maren asked only one question, very calmly, whether she was being dismissed because someone else had thrown wine at her. Gerald Pike couldn't answer. He pushed the paper toward her and lowered his gaze to the desk. She signed it. When she reached the parking lot behind the building, she stopped for a moment to work through the numbers in her head, and this time the calculation wasn't as simple as the subtraction she had done the night before. Losing her job with the cleaning company meant losing the group insurance plan she had struggled to pay for over the past 4 years, the plan that had refused to cover the surgery but still remained a condition of the hospital, allowing her to pay the remaining balance in installments. Without it, her installment plan application would be canceled within 30 days. Without it, the $62,000 was no longer something she could divide into smaller payments. It was a wall she would have to pay for all at once. She stood in the middle of the parking lot, still holding the paper she had just signed, and understood that the night before, she hadn't lost only a plastic beaded bracelet. The black car was parked in the corner of the lot, about 20 paces away. Rafe Castellano was leaning against its door, without Enzo beside him, without anyone else, and she had no idea how long he had been standing there. He didn't approach her. He waited for her to come to him, and she did, because there was no longer any point in avoiding him. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't offer to take her home, didn't offer to find her another job, and didn't say a single word about money. He only asked who had told Gerald Pike to dismiss her. In Pittsburgh, that wasn't really a question. It was the first step in a process everyone knew where it would lead. Maren looked at him and said she didn't need to know. She said that if he found the person responsible and forced that man to give her job back, then by tomorrow afternoon the whole city would know that Rafe Castellano had intervened for a woman who cleaned cars, and she would never again be able to go anywhere in the city without people watching her from behind. She said she had spent 7 years living in such a way that no one would watch her from behind. Rafe listened in silence. Then he said he owed her his life, and a life couldn't be repaid by standing by and watching. Maren folded the paper in her hand into quarters, slipped it into her coat pocket, and said something he would continue thinking about for many nights afterward. She said she understood that he was repaying a debt, and she didn't blame him for that, but once he had repaid it, She would become the one indebted to him, and she didn't have the strength to owe anyone else anything more in this life. 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, Rafe Castellano walked into the pediatric waiting room at Mercy West Hospital without Enzo beside him, without anyone beside him. He carried no flowers, no gift, nothing at all. He had told his driver to park 2 blocks away and had walked the rest of the distance, though he didn't know exactly why he had chosen to do that. The waiting room held more than a dozen orange plastic chairs, a television mounted on the wall showing a cartoon with the sound turned off, and a little girl sitting in the second row, her legs swinging because her feet didn't yet reach the floor, a coloring book cradled in her hands. He recognized her immediately, although they had never met, because there was an elastic bracelet strung with glittering plastic beads around her left wrist, and because she looked strangers directly in the face with the same unflinching gaze he had seen in her mother at the showroom that night. He sat down 2 seats away from her. Poppy studied him for about 3 seconds, very carefully, from his shoes all the way up to his face, then asked whether he was her mother's friend. Rafe said not exactly. The little girl asked what he was then, and he, a man who had sat across from judges, port owners, and rivals carrying guns beneath their coats without ever needing more than 2 seconds to consider an answer, remained silent for a moment before saying that he owed her mother something. Poppy nodded thoughtfully, looking as though she understood, then asked directly, in the way children asked the questions adults spent their entire lives avoiding, how much he owed her. Rafe opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at the 6-year-old girl, waiting for an answer with perfectly honest patience, and for the first time in 7 years, he couldn't find a single thing to say. The little girl waited a while longer, and when he still didn't answer, she asked no more. Instead, she opened her coloring book and asked what his favorite color was. He said he wasn't sure. Poppy told him everyone had to have a favorite color, then decided for him that his was probably blue because his clothes were black, and people who wore black usually liked blue. That was the rule. She handed him a blue crayon and pointed to one corner of the picture, where a fish was swimming. Rafe held the crayon in a hand accustomed to holding very different things, and he colored that fish carefully, without going beyond the lines. Poppy told him he colored beautifully. She said her mother always went outside the lines because her mother was always in a hurry. Then, without anyone asking, she explained that she was there that day so the doctor could listen to her heart, that there was a small hole in it, but it was all right because the doctor had said the hole could be repaired. She only had to wait. She said the word wait with such calm acceptance, as though it were simply an ordinary fact of life, like rain or having to go to bed early. On the small table beside the row of chairs, the little girl's medical file lay partly open, and Rafe didn't need to lean down to read the diagnosis printed in bold at the top of the page, along with the surgery date box beneath it, where 2 dates had been crossed out and a 3rd line remained blank. He stared at those 2 crossed-out dates longer than he should have. He had signed papers that cost hundreds of people their jobs, had read reports containing figures 1,000 times greater than the one in this file, and he had never seen a single stroke of ink carry so much weight. The examination room door opened. Marin stepped into the hallway, still holding the new appointment paper, and stopped abruptly when she saw the scene in the 2nd row, her daughter pointing at something in the coloring book, while the most powerful man in Pittsburgh sat beside her with his head bowed, holding a blue crayon in his hand. That evening, after Poppy had fallen asleep, someone knocked on the door of the 3rd-floor apartment. Marin knew who it was before she looked through the peephole. She opened the door without saying anything and stepped back to let him in, not because she wanted him inside, but because she didn't want them talking in the hallway where Mrs. Buchanan might overhear. Rafe entered and stopped in the middle of the cramped kitchen, and for one brief moment, they both saw the absurdity of the scene clearly. The man who owned half the city's docks, standing in a kitchen so narrow that he could touch both walls simply by stretching out his arms. He didn't sit down. He took a check from the inside pocket of his coat, placed it on the kitchen table beside the stack of papers Marin hadn't yet put away, and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. She didn't need to look at the amount. She stared at it for 1 second, then raised her eyes. Rafe spoke before she could open her mouth. He said it wasn't a reward, wasn't a ransom, wasn't payment for anyone's silence. He said he had spoken to the hospital, that the surgery wasn't complicated if it was performed at the proper time, that the finest doctor on the East Coast worked only a 40-minute drive away, and that the amount written on that piece of paper was, to him, only a very small part of a sum he signed away every month without reading. He said all of this in a calm voice, without condescension, without taking credit for his generosity, and perhaps that was precisely what made the offer even more difficult to refuse. Maren listened to everything. Then she reached out, placed 2 fingers against the edge of the check, and pushed it all the way back across the table toward him. She said she hadn't jumped into that river in exchange for money. Then she continued slowly, saying that if she accepted that piece of paper now, the night of February 14th, 7 years earlier, would no longer be the night she had saved a man. It would become the night she had stood on a bridge, recognized an opportunity, and returned 7 years later to sell it. She said she didn't have much, but those 3 seconds she had spent standing on the bridge that night were the only thing in her life she knew with certainty she had done right, and she wouldn't allow anyone, not even him, not even with good intentions, to turn them into a transaction. Rafe didn't argue. He didn't say another word about the surgery, the 40-minute drive, or the finest doctor on the East Coast. He picked up the check, folded it in half, and slipped it neatly back into the inside pocket of his coat, as though it had never been taken out. Then he reached into the pocket on the other side and placed something else on the table. The faded gray wool glove, torn at the tips of the index and middle fingers, a single glove without its mate. He didn't say what it was. He didn't need to. Maren stood motionless for about 5 seconds. Then she reached out and picked it up very slowly with both hands. She turned it over and touched the worn wool around the wrist, the place she had mended herself with black thread 7 years earlier because she hadn't had enough money to buy another pair. The stitches were still there, and as she held that glove, Rafe saw her hands begin to tremble. It wasn't the trembling of emotion. He had lived long enough in his world to know one kind of trembling from another, and this kind he knew well. This was fear. He quietly told her not to be afraid of him. Maren looked up, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't read, something that resembled both pity and despair. She said she had never been afraid of him. Then she placed the glove on the table, pushed it toward him exactly as she had pushed back the check, and said it was late. Her daughter was asleep in the next room, and she would like him to leave. While Rafe stood in that cramped 3rd-floor kitchen in Lawrenceville, about 6 miles to the east, Celeste Harrington was driving to her father's house for the first time in 4 months. She hadn't slept for 3 nights. Her phone held 400 unread messages, and within half a day she had learned how to sort them into categories. Messages from old acquaintances pretending to check on her while fishing for details. Messages from strangers cursing her. And worst of all, messages from journalists writing with perfect politeness, inviting her to speak, and offering her the opportunity to tell her side of the story. The family attorneys had blurred her face in the original video, but everyone in Pittsburgh knew who she was, and by the 2nd day, the 2 brands she represented had quietly removed her photographs from their home pages, without sending her a single line of notice. She arrived at her father's house close to 10 o'clock that evening, and she came seeking something very simple, something any 29-year-old daughter had the right to hope for, to hear someone tell her that she wasn't as terrible as people were saying. Weston Harrington received her in his office without rising from behind his desk or turning off the screen before him. He listened to her speak for 6 minutes. She recounted that evening in her own way, told him how Rafe had removed her hand in front of 30 people, how he hadn't even looked at her once, told him what people were writing about her online, and by the end, her voice broke, and she said she no longer knew what she was supposed to do. Weston waited until she had finished. Then he removed his glasses, placed them on the desk, and said the sentence Celeste would remember word for the rest of her life. He said that humiliating a servant wasn't a serious matter. The problem was that she had caused a commotion just as he was about to sign. The room remained silent for a while. Celeste sat there with her hand still resting on the desk, and she felt something inside her chest quietly slip downward and break somewhere very deep, without making a sound. In a small voice, she asked whether he wasn't even going to ask if she was all right. Weston put his glasses back on and said he had spent 11 months bringing the 2 families to the point where they could sit at the same table, that the agreement involving the port route and the Northern Cold Storage Network depended upon the Harrington name and the Castellano name appearing side by side on a wedding invitation, and that now the entire city was watching her fiancé remove her hand as though he were brushing something filthy from his sleeve. He didn't say anything cruel. He didn't raise his voice. He merely explained the situation, methodically and clearly, exactly as he would have presented it to a board of directors. And it was that very clarity that made Celeste understand. For 29 years, she had believed her father was stern but loved his daughter, that this marriage was a sensible arrangement and affection would come later, that she was his daughter first and his instrument second. Sitting in that room, she realized the order was reversed. She wasn't a daughter who had just been hurt. She was a contractual condition that had just malfunctioned. She asked him one more question, the last question she would ask that night. What would he do if Rafe called off the engagement? Weston looked at her through his glasses and answered in a voice so calm that a chill ran down Celeste's spine. He said Rafe wouldn't call it off. He had a way to keep him at the table. He offered no further explanation, and Celeste asked for none, because by then she had begun to understand that there were some questions whose answers were better left unknown. She drove back to her apartment through the night, and for the first time in 3 days, she no longer thought about what people were writing about her. She thought about the woman kneeling on the floor, gathering plastic beads one by one, and she thought, with sudden clarity, that at least that woman had a child who had sat and strung a bracelet for her. On Saturday morning, Marin went to interview for a job with another cleaning company across the river, the 4th company in 4 days. They accepted her application, smiled politely, and said they would contact her, and she knew perfectly well that they wouldn't, because the moment she sat down, she saw the interviewer glance quickly at a phone screen, before looking up at her for 1 beat longer than necessary. She walked out to the parking lot behind the building, where she had left the old car she still possessed only because it was too old for anyone to bother repossessing, and there was a man standing beside it. He appeared to be in his late 50s, wore a dark coat, and held nothing in his hands. He stood there casually, like a man waiting for his wife to finish shopping. He didn't approach her. He didn't touch her. He even stepped back half a pace as she came closer to preserve the distance between them, a gesture so polite that it made everything worse. Then he took a photograph from inside his coat and placed it on the hood of her car, with the image facing upward, setting it down as gently as though it were a business card. Marin looked down. It was a photograph of her apartment door on the 3rd floor, number 406, painted brown, with a long scratch at the lower right corner from the day she had dragged the refrigerator past it while moving in. The picture had been taken during daylight from about 10 feet away, in the middle of the hallway. The man said nothing for several seconds, giving her enough time to study it carefully. Then he spoke in a calm, quiet voice, that same voice, the one she had heard through a thin wooden door 7 years earlier, and recognized now from the very first word, saying that she had lived very peacefully for the past 7 years. He paused, then added that she shouldn't ruin it. There was nothing more. No specific threat, no name spoken, no detail she could take to a police station and explain in any meaningful way. He gave her a courteous nod, then turned and walked out of the parking lot with the unhurried stride of a man who had no reason to rush. Marin remained there until she could no longer hear his footsteps. She didn't pick up the photograph immediately. She stared at it a while longer, and what turned her insides cold wasn't the photograph itself, but its quality. It wasn't blurred. It wasn't crooked. It hadn't been taken hastily from inside a coat pocket. It was the work of someone who had stood in the middle of the hallway with enough time to focus the lens and frame the image carefully. Someone who knew with certainty that no door would open at that moment. She drove home, and throughout the journey, she looked into the rearview mirror more often than she looked at the road ahead. She pulled into her parking space, walked up 3 flights of stairs, unlocked the door, stepped inside, locked it again, slid the additional bolt into place, then stood with her back pressed against that door. The apartment was empty. Outside, the hallway was silent. She slid downward until she was sitting on the floor, her back still against the door, the photograph clutched in her hand. And only as she sat there did she truly understand the thing she had spent 7 years trying to tell herself wasn't true. She had believed she had escaped. She had moved 3 times, changed her phone number 3 times, abandoned school, abandoned the profession she had loved since she was 16, severed every connection with the people she had once known, and she had believed all that sacrifice had purchased invisibility for her. But no one needed to find a person they had never lost. Throughout those 7 years, he had known where she lived, what she did, what color her front door was painted, and which corner was scratched. He had left her alone not because he couldn't find her, but because she was doing exactly what he wanted, remaining silent and making her life smaller. She had willingly remained inside the box he had drawn around her 7 years earlier, all while believing it was proof of her own cleverness. Marin sat on the floor for a very long time. Then she rose, walked into the kitchen, opened the bottom drawer, and pushed the photograph beneath everything inside, even the old bills, before closing the drawer again. She didn't cry, but that night, For the first time in 4 years, she dragged the kitchen chair across the floor and wedged it against the front door before going to bed. On Sunday afternoon, someone knocked on the door. Maren was sitting at the kitchen table, and her first instinct wasn't to get up and answer it, but to turn and look at the chair she had wedged behind the door the night before. The knock came a second time, 3 neat, unhurried taps. She walked over, put her eye to the peephole, and her entire body went rigid. Standing alone in the hallway, with no one beside her, was Celeste Harrington. Maren didn't open the door. She stepped back and stood motionless. And in that moment, countless things passed through her mind. The photograph of her door, hidden at the bottom of the drawer. The Harrington name mentioned on the morning news. The thought that perhaps everything that had happened to her over the past 4 days had begun with the woman standing on the other side of that wooden door. There was silence outside for a while. Then Celeste spoke through the closed door without knocking again. She said she knew Maren was inside. She said she hadn't come to ask for anything, nor had she come to apologize, because she understood that an apology spoken through a door at a moment like this would only make her feel better and wouldn't help the person on the other side. Her voice bore no trace of the woman who had stood in the middle of the showroom that night. It was hoarse and slow, breaking in places where it shouldn't have broken. She said she was leaving something outside the door. She said it had never truly belonged to her to return, but she couldn't think of anything else to do. Then she fell silent for several more seconds, and Maren heard something being placed very gently on the hallway floor. Celeste said one final thing, that she had watched the video more times than everyone on the internet put together, and that she hadn't watched it to blame anyone else. Then came the sound of her shoes receding slowly toward the stairs, before fading away completely. Maren remained exactly where she was for nearly 10 more minutes. She waited until she was certain the hallway was empty. Waited until she heard the main entrance downstairs close, then pulled the chair aside, unlocked the door, and opened it a crack. On the hallway floor, directly in front of her threshold, was a small cardboard box, the kind used for jewelry, without a ribbon, a card, or the sender's name. She carried it inside, locked the door again, returned the chair to its former place, then sat at the kitchen table and opened the box. Inside, resting on a layer of white tissue paper, were all the multicolored plastic beads from the broken bracelet, along with the stretched elastic cord, neatly coiled and placed to one side. Someone had gathered them from the stone floor of the showroom, picking them up one by one, even the beads that had rolled beneath the cars and into the narrow gaps between things. Maren sat in silence for a very long time. Then she poured everything onto the table and began counting. She arranged the beads in rows according to color, then separated the 4 engraved beads, the letter O, the number 2, and 1 letter M. She counted them once. Then she swept them together and counted a second time, more slowly, touching each bead with her fingertip to make certain she hadn't missed one. The result was the same both times. Every bead was there except one, the first bead engraved with the letter M, the bead a man had bent down to pick up 7 days earlier in front of 30 people and had forgotten to return. Maren stared at the rows of plastic beads arranged across the table, and she felt something unsettling rise inside her, a feeling she didn't want to name. The woman who had torn the cleaning cloth from her hand, thrown wine over her, and called her the kind of person who didn't know where she was standing, was the very same woman who had sent someone crawling across the stone floor to recover every 10-cent plastic bead belonging to a child. It erased nothing. Maren knew that clearly. But it wasn't nothing either. She swept all the beads into her palm, poured them back into the box, replaced the lid, and put it on top of the cabinet beside the tin cookie box. Maren called at 11 o'clock on Tuesday night, after sitting for more than an hour, staring at that phone number on the screen. It was the number Rafe had written by hand on the back of a piece of paper and left on the kitchen table the day he came to her apartment, and 3 times she had meant to throw it away, only to stop herself all 3 times. For the past 7 years, she had never willingly called anyone about anything important, because every call left a trail, and because silence was the only thing she still controlled. He answered after the second ring. She didn't say hello. She spoke at once, her voice so calm that even she was surprised, and told him that his tire hadn't blown. There was no sound from the other end. She continued with a second sentence, saying that someone had stood on the bridge and watched until the car disappeared completely beneath the water. Then she fell silent. Rafe didn't ask what she was talking about. He didn't tell her to calm down, didn't ask whether she was certain, didn't say any of the things people usually said when they heard something like that at 11 o'clock at night. He remained silent long enough for her to hear the rhythm of his breathing change once. Then he asked, very quietly, whether she had seen the man's face clearly. Marin looked down at the kitchen table. She thought of the brown painted door with the scratch in the lower right corner, of the photograph hidden at the bottom of a drawer less than 6 feet from where she sat, of the room beside her, where a child slept with a heart that hadn't yet been repaired. And she said, "Too dark." 2 words. Nothing more. Rafe didn't ask again. He thanked her for calling and said that if anything happened, at any time, she should call that number again. Then the call ended. On the other side of the city, Rafe remained seated in his office for a long time after the phone screen went dark. For 7 years, he had told himself a story, that what happened that night had been an accident, that the road was slick, that the snow was heavy, that sometimes these things happened even to the most careful drivers. He had believed that story, not because it was convincing, but because the other possibility required him to ask a question that, at 26 years old, only 4 months after taking his father's chair, and with more than a dozen pairs of eyes inside the family watching his every move, he hadn't possessed the strength to ask. The police report said a tire had blown. He had read that report from his hospital bed, folded it shut, and never read it a second time. Now, 7 years later, a woman had just spoken 2 sentences to him, and both contained things no one could have known unless they had been standing in that exact place at that exact moment. He called Enzo close to midnight. He offered no explanation. He merely instructed him to retrieve the entire original file on the Bellwether Bridge accident, not the summary, and then added something that made Enzo ask him to repeat it. Just to be certain, he told him not to go through anyone inside the family. Back in the 3rd-floor apartment, Marin placed the phone on the table and sat without moving. She had lied. She knew exactly what she had just done. For 7 years, she had remained silent, and silence could still be defended. Silence was what people chose when they had been driven into a corner. But tonight, she had done something entirely different. A man had asked her a direct question, and she had looked into the darkness and told him there was nothing there, even though she knew perfectly well that the darkness contained a face she had remembered for 7 years, without forgetting a single feature. She told herself she had done it for her child. That was true. But she also knew something else. The man on the bridge that night had spent 7 years teaching her this exact lesson, that speaking meant losing everything, while silence purchased peace. And tonight, when she spoke the 2 words, "too dark," into the phone, he had won once again without even needing to be there. It took Enzo Rinaldi 4 days. He didn't go through anyone inside the family, exactly as instructed, and because of that, retrieving a 7-year-old file from the city police archives took far longer than it should have, and cost him several connections he had never intended to use in his lifetime. On Saturday morning, he entered Rafe's office, carrying 2 sheets of paper. Only 2, and said nothing at all. He placed the first sheet on the desk. It was the final page of the scene report from the Bellwether Bridge accident on the night of February 14th. The conclusion contained exactly 2 words. Blown tire. There was no entry recording that the tire had been seized as evidence. There was no note of any mechanical inspection. The car had been raised from the river the following morning, taken directly to a salvage yard south of the city, and crushed within 9 days, far sooner than standard procedure allowed for a vehicle involved in an accident that had left someone critically injured. In the lower right corner was the signature of the officer in charge. Enzo placed 1 finger on the name and said the man had applied for early retirement 11 weeks after that night, at the age of 47, and had moved to Florida 3 months after the report was closed. He still lived there now, in a house with a private boat dock. Then Enzo placed the second sheet beside the first, parallel to it, their edges perfectly aligned. It was an old extract concerning the operating rights to Port Route Number 4, the route the Castellano family had controlled for 22 years and lost in the quarter following the night of February 14th, during the very period when Rafe was still in the hospital, and more than a dozen pairs of eyes inside the family were watching to see whether his father's chair would remain standing. On the line naming the party that received the rights were 3 words. Harrington Shipping. Enzo stepped back and still said nothing. He had worked with this man for 11 years, and he knew there were times when the worst thing one could do was offer an explanation. Rafe didn't pick up either sheet. He merely sat there with both hands resting on the desk, staring down at the 2 pages lying side by side, and in his mind, The scattered fragments of 7 years began finding their proper places in a way he desperately wished they wouldn't. He remembered why this marriage had been proposed, who had proposed it first, who had patiently spent 11 months bringing the two families to the point where they could sit at the same table. He remembered the expression on Weston Harrington's face the night the two families had shaken hands in front of 4 others, the expression of a man who had waited a very long time and had finally received what he had been waiting for. He remembered what he himself had thought that night, that it was a good arrangement, that after 7 years of struggle, everything was finally becoming stable again. Rafe remained silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice so quiet that Enzo had to lean forward to hear him. He said that if he was wrong, he would destroy an innocent family, destroy a woman whose greatest offense so far had been throwing a glass of wine at someone. He paused. Then he continued, saying that if he was right, then 3 weeks from now he would stand before 300 people and marry the daughter of the man who had tried to shoot him on Bellwether Bridge. Enzo asked what his boss intended to do. Rafe didn't answer immediately. He reached out and drew the 2 sheets even closer together, then said they weren't enough. They showed a carelessly written report and a port route, changing hands at precisely the right moment. And in this city, both things could be coincidences. A man like Weston Harrington could sit across from anyone with those 2 coincidences between them, without changing expression once. He said he needed something else, something that couldn't be explained away with the word coincidence. Then he fell silent. And both men in that room knew that such a thing could come from only one person, the woman who had spoken 2 sentences to him over the phone at 11 o'clock at night and stopped just before the 3rd. That night, Marin took the tin cookie box down from the top of the cabinet. She didn't intend to count the money. She had counted it 3 times in 2 weeks, and the amount hadn't changed. She emptied all the money onto the table, swept it to one side, then used her fingertip to pry up the piece of cardboard lining the bottom of the box, the piece she had cut to fit perfectly 7 years earlier, and hadn't lifted once since then. Beneath it, wrapped in a scrap of tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a ring, white gold, heavy, its face cast in the shape of a ship's wheel with 8 spokes, its lines sharp and decisive, the kind of ring people had custom-made rather than bought from a store. Engraved inside were 2 initials with a period between them, W.H. It had fallen onto the rocky bank on the night of February 14th, when the man on the bridge leaned over the railing for a clearer look, and Marin had found it while she sat waiting for the approaching sirens, one hand still cradling the head of a man who was slowly losing consciousness. She had taken it home that night without understanding why. 3 days later, when someone knocked on her door and a voice spoke from behind the thin wood, she understood. For 7 years, that ring had remained at the bottom of a cookie tin, beneath a layer of loose bills, in a rented kitchen. And it was the reason that every time she moved, she carried the box in her own arms inside the car instead of packing it with everything else. She placed the ring on the table and stared at it for a very long time. She thought about the 2 words "too dark" that she had spoken into the phone the week before. She thought about the photograph of her front door hidden at the bottom of a drawer less than 7 feet away. She thought about what 7 years of silence had purchased for her, a job she had just lost, an insurance plan she had just lost, an installment plan application that was about to be canceled, and a child whose heart was being forced to work harder than it could bear, while the hospital continued postponing her surgery again and again. She had done everything they demanded of her, and she had still lost. Close to 2 o'clock in the morning, she picked up her phone and dialed the number. Rafe answered on the first ring, as though he were still awake. Marin didn't speak in circles. She said she had lied to him. She said she had seen the man's face clearly. The other end of the line fell silent. Then Rafe spoke, his voice quiet and slow, saying that he knew. He said he had known from the moment she spoke those 2 words that night. He didn't blame her with a single word. He only asked whether she was safe, and Marin felt her throat tighten because no one had asked her that question in 7 years. She said she had something. She said it had been inside her home for 7 years. Rafe told her he would send someone to retrieve it that very night. Marin said no. He asked again, believing he had misheard her, and she said she would bring it herself. She said that if she handed it to a man who knocked on her door at 3 o'clock in the morning, then by the next day it would be nothing more than an object in the possession of the Castellano family, and a man like the one from the bridge would sit before anyone and say he had lost that ring years earlier, that someone must have found it, that he didn't understand why it had ended up in the hands of the person accusing him. She said an object could be denied. A person standing there and speaking was harder to deny. Rafe remained silent for a long while, then said he couldn't allow her to do that. Marin said he had no right to make that decision. She said that for 7 years, she had hidden, kept her head lowered, and made her life smaller exactly as they wanted, and the result was that he still knew what color her front door was painted. She said she had nowhere left to retreat. Then she asked him one question, whether his wedding was 3 weeks away. And when Rafe said yes, she told him that she would go there. She would stand before all of them, and she would speak. Rafe did 3 things that afternoon, and he did all 3 without asking anyone's permission. First, he called Mercy West Hospital before lunch, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, the entire cost of the surgery had been paid, with no installment plan and no collateral required, and the blank surgery date box in Poppy Holloway's file had been filled in with black ink. The operation would take place 3 days after the engagement party, as soon as all the preoperative results were available. Marin learned about it at 5 o'clock when the hospital called to confirm the schedule, and she stood in the middle of her kitchen listening without being able to say a word. Then she drove straight to him. She was so angry that her hands shook as she opened the car door. She said she had already made herself clear, that she wouldn't accept it, that he had no right to go behind her back and do something like this, that he must think his money bought him the right to make decisions for everyone else. She spoke without stopping, and gave him no chance to interrupt, while Rafe stood and listened with his hands still at his sides, never cutting her off once, exactly as he had listened to her every time before. When she finally stopped to draw breath, he spoke, and he said only one thing. He said she had the right to refuse anything he offered her, and he would never offer it a second time, but she didn't have the right to refuse on behalf of her daughter. Marin opened her mouth to answer. Then no words came. She stood there in the courtyard, and everything she had held down for 7 years suddenly rose inside her all at once. 7 years of counting her daughter's breaths at night, 6 years of staring at the 2 crossed-out dates on the appointment paper, 6 years of doing the subtraction in her head, and always reaching the same answer. She raised both hands to cover her face and wept without making a sound, her shoulders trembling in waves. It was the only time in 7 years that she cried in front of another person. Rafe didn't approach her and didn't touch her. He simply remained where he was until she raised her head, then silently handed her the handkerchief from his pocket. The second thing he did was have Poppy taken to Mrs. Ada Buchanan's apartment that very evening. The little girl was told she would be staying with Mrs. Buchanan for a few days because her mother had something to take care of, and she received the news with all the excitement of a 6-year-old allowed to sleep somewhere unfamiliar, insisting on bringing both her coloring book and her box of crayons. Mrs. Buchanan asked no questions. She merely studied Marin for a long moment from the doorway, then nodded. Outside, parked only a short distance from the 3rd-floor hallway, 2 of Enzo's men remained in a car throughout the night, and they would remain there for 3 more nights. Marin had intended to object to this as well, but when she turned toward Rafe, he only said that this was his responsibility, not hers, and she fell silent because this time she understood that he was right. The third thing, and the one that made Enzo ask twice to be certain he had heard correctly, was Rafe's order that the engagement party proceed exactly as planned. There would be no postponement, no change of location, and no reduction in the guest list. All 300 guests would still receive reminders. The flowers would still be ordered, and no one would attempt to withdraw the invitations already sent. Enzo said that doing so meant putting everyone in the same room, the entire Harrington family, all 4 families that had witnessed the 2 houses shake hands, and half the city's public officials. Rafe said yes, and that was precisely what he wanted. He said that if this matter were handled according to the family's usual methods, inside a closed room with only 6 people aware of it, then in the end, it would remain nothing more than the word of the Castellano family against the word of the Harrington family, and in this city, 2 such accounts would cancel each other out, and everything would disappear just as it had 7 years earlier. He said a woman had remained silent for 7 years, and had decided she would be silent no longer, and if she had chosen to stand and speak before 300 people, then the only thing he needed to do was ensure that all 300 of them were present to hear her. On Saturday evening, the Castellano estate had been ablaze with light since 7 o'clock. All 300 guests had arrived before 8, and among them were the 4 families that had witnessed the 2 houses shake hands, 2 city council members, and people who had flown in from Chicago and Baltimore simply to spend one evening in that room. Weston Harrington stood in the front row beside his daughter. Celeste didn't say a word for the entire hour. She had arrived 20 minutes late, walked straight to her place without stopping to greet anyone, and looked around the room exactly once, with the expression of someone trying to understand why everything was proceeding normally when it shouldn't have been. At exactly 8:30, Rafe stepped onto the platform. The room fell silent at once. He held a sheet of paper, the speech the family's communications department had drafted and revised 4 times during the week, and he looked at it for about 2 seconds before placing it face down on the lectern. Enzo, standing in the corner of the room, clasped his hands in front of him. At that precise moment, the great doors at the far end of the room opened. Everyone turned to look. A woman walked in alone, wearing an old cloth coat faded at the elbows, her hair tied neatly back, her left hand closed as though she were holding something very small. She walked straight down the center aisle without looking at anyone, and of the 300 people there, at least 200 recognized her immediately, because over the past 2 weeks, her face had appeared on their phone screens more often than that of anyone else in the city. A murmur rose through the room, then died away. Celeste turned her head, and her entire body went rigid. Weston Harrington didn't turn around. He merely tilted his head slightly, just enough to glance from the corner of his eye, and his right hand, resting on the arm of his chair, closed into a fist. Marin reached the foot of the platform and stopped. She didn't climb the steps. She simply extended her hand and opened her palm, and Rafe leaned down to take what lay inside it. Then she stepped back and remained there, facing the 300 people watching her, neither hiding her face nor lowering her head. Rafe straightened before the microphone. He told them nothing. He didn't mention the snow, the river, the 2 hours spent lying on the rocky bank, or the 7 years of searching. Half the room had already heard all of that. He merely raised one hand, held a small object between 2 fingers, and lifted it just high enough for the light to touch it. A white gold ring with an 8-spoked ship's wheel cast into its face. In a voice so quiet that the people in the back rows had to lean forward, he said that this had fallen from Bellwether Bridge on the night of February 14th, 7 years earlier. Then he stopped. No one in the room dared breathe heavily. He continued, still speaking just as softly, saying that whoever wished to reclaim it should come forward. For the next 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then something happened that Rafe had anticipated and Weston Harrington hadn't. People began turning their heads, not all at once. First came the 2 men in the 3rd row, men who had worked in the shipping industry long enough to know who in this city wore a custom-made ring bearing a ship's wheel. Then the people seated beside them turned because they saw those men turn. Then an entire section on the right side of the room followed. In less than 10 seconds, nearly all 300 faces in the room were turned toward the same place. The front row, the second chair from the aisle. Celeste, seated directly beside him, turned to look at her father as well. And in that moment, she realized something she would never forget. He didn't look surprised, not in the slightest. A man falsely accused before 300 people would have leaped to his feet, his face reddening, demanding to know what this was about. Her father remained seated, both hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the platform, wearing the expression of a man rapidly calculating what he still had left in his hand. And Marin, standing at the foot of the platform, turned and looked at him for the first time in 7 years, straight into his face, without blinking. Weston Harrington rose to his feet. He did it without haste, fastening the button of his suit jacket, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and assured, the voice of a man who had addressed rooms far more crowded than this one many times before. He said he didn't understand what was happening. He said he owned 4 rings of that design, all commissioned from the same place, and that he had reported one of them missing many years earlier, though he couldn't remember exactly which year. He said he had come there that evening, as a man preparing to give his daughter away in marriage, and that if the Castellano family had something to say to him, it should have been said somewhere else. Several people in the room nodded. It was a good answer, and he knew it. Then he made a mistake. Perhaps because, in 40 years, no one had ever forced him to stand before 300 people and explain himself. Perhaps because he had seen the woman at the foot of the platform turn and look directly into his face. He let out a laugh, dry and brief, and said he understood what this was about now. Then he said that girl had promised to remain silent. The sentence fell into the middle of the room. No one moved. Of the 300 people present, perhaps only a third immediately understood what had just happened. But that third was enough to create the kind of silence the remaining 2/3 could feel against their skin. Because from the moment Rafe Castellano stepped onto the platform until that very second, he hadn't mentioned a single name. He hadn't said who the woman was. He hadn't said anyone had promised anything to anyone. He had only held up a ring and asked who wished to reclaim it. Weston Harrington himself was the first person in that room to say someone had promised to remain silent, and he had said it about a woman he should have had no reason to know. Celeste, sitting a little more than 3 feet from her father, slowly raised one hand to cover her mouth. Weston realized it at once. Everyone could see it on his face. The moment his own words turned around and sank their teeth into the man who had spoken them. He opened his mouth to say something more, and at that exact moment, from the back of the room near the side entrance, a shot rang out. It wasn't as loud as it was in the movies. It was sharp and dry, striking the high ceiling before breaking into overlapping echoes. The crystal chandelier overhead trembled, and its glass pieces continued chiming against one another for several seconds afterward. All 300 people ducked at once. Chairs overturned, glasses fell, and someone screamed. By the time the first heads began to rise, it was already over. Enzo Rinaldi was standing directly in front of the platform, in a place where less than 2 seconds earlier he hadn't been. His back turned toward the far end of the room, both arms spread wide to shield the man behind him. Then his knees gave way, slowly, almost gently, and he collapsed to one side. Rafe caught him before he struck the floor. At the back of the room, 3 Castellano men had already forced the shooter down onto the stone and were holding him there. Everything happened within about 10 seconds. After those 10 seconds, there was no second shot. No one was running anymore, and all that remained was the sound of 300 people breathing, the voice of someone calling emergency services on a phone, and the chandelier still softly chiming overhead. Weston Harrington remained standing exactly where he had been in the front row, alone, with no one within 10 feet of him. Rafe knelt on the floor, cradling Enzo's head, and for the first time that evening, everyone heard him raise his voice. He called Enzo's name twice. Enzo didn't answer, and through the crowd pulling away, only one person was moving in the opposite direction, weaving past the overturned chairs, removing her old coat as she walked, then dropping to her knees beside the 2 men. Among the 300 people present that evening were surgeons, attorneys, 2 city council members, and a man who had served in the military. Not one of them knelt down. They moved aside, rose from their chairs, backed toward the walls, and raised their phones to call for help. Only one person moved against the crowd. Marin dropped to her knees on Enzo's left side, pressed 2 fingers to his neck, counted silently for 3 seconds, then said loudly that he still had a pulse. She yanked the cloth from the nearest table, sending everything on it crashing to the floor, then folded the cloth into quarters, then eighths, forming a thick, square pad. She placed it over the wound and pressed both palms down on it, locked her elbows straight, then drove the full weight of her upper body downward, exactly as people were taught during the 3rd week of a first aid course. Without looking at Rafe, she told him to keep Enzo's head still and not let it turn to either side. He obeyed. Then she looked up, swept her gaze across the crowd, and pointed at the 2 nearest men, both half again her size, dressed in formal suits, standing frozen 3 paces away. She called to them. She said, "You and you, come here." Neither man moved during the first half-second, then both stepped forward because the voice commanding them allowed no other response. She told them to lift Enzo's legs above his heart and hold them there, not to lower them, not to let go no matter what happened. She ordered a 3rd man to remove his suit jacket and lay it across Enzo's chest. She asked who had called emergency services and how long it would take them to arrive, and when someone answered 7 minutes, she called out that they should be told to prepare intravenous access, male, approximately 40 years old, partially conscious, pulse rapid and weak. She spoke in terms no one in that room had imagined she knew. Then she leaned close to Enzo's face and called his name. She told him to look at her. She told him not to close his eyes. She began counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4, steady, neither fast nor slow, and after every 20 counts, she stopped to call his name once and ordered him to answer her with a blink. He blinked. She continued counting. She counted that way for 7 minutes without changing her rhythm once, without lifting her hands from the folded cloth for even a second. Her arms began trembling with exhaustion during the 4th minute, but the pressure never weakened. The entire room listened to her count in silence. 300 people, no one speaking, no one leaving, and her counting was the only sound inside the Castellano estate that evening. When the paramedics rushed in, she didn't rise immediately. She kept her hands in place until one of them pressed his hands over the exact same spot and said, "I've got it." Only then did she release the pressure. She delivered her entire report in 15 seconds. The time, Enzo's initial condition, everything she had done, and the paramedic glanced quickly up at her before asking which department she worked in. Maren didn't answer. She moved back, rose to her feet, and only then looked down at her hands. Rafe was still kneeling on the floor. He looked at her, and in his mind, the final pieces of the past 7 years fell into place. He had thought of the woman on the bridge as a kind person, someone who had jumped into the water out of compassion, an act of the heart that anyone might have performed if they had possessed enough courage during those 3 seconds. He had been wrong. She hadn't jumped that night simply because she was brave. She had jumped because she knew what she was doing, knew how many minutes she had, knew where to strike the window, knew how to roll a man onto his side. And for the 7 years that followed, that ability had been buried beneath a cleaning uniform, worn thin at the shoulders, beneath 11-hour night shifts, beneath a cookie tin filled with loose bills. The man standing amid the front row hadn't merely taken 7 years of her silence. He had taken away the person she should have become. 3 o'clock in the morning, the 4th floor of Mercy West Hospital, the hallway outside the recovery room. Enzo Rinaldi had survived the 4-hour surgery, and the doctor said he would walk again, though he might have a slight limp for several months. Down in the lobby, Celeste Harrington had been sitting across from 2 federal investigators since 1 o'clock. She had no attorney with her, though she had that right. And when they reminded her of it for the 2nd time, she merely said she understood. Then she placed the only thing she had on the table, a worn leather-bound notebook she had kept throughout her 3 years as her father's assistant, along with the earlier notebooks she had saved, recording every appointment, every name, every location, every hour, including meetings that never later appeared on any official calendar. 7 years recorded in the small, even handwriting of a daughter who had once believed she was helping her father. She pushed the notebook across the table and said nothing more. At 4 o'clock, she went up to the 4th floor. Maren was sitting in a row of chairs in the hallway, both hands resting on her knees. Celeste stopped a few paces away and spoke. She didn't say she had made a mistake. Didn't say she had been under stress at the time. Didn't say she wasn't that kind of person. She said she had thrown that glass of wine because she knew the man she was about to marry didn't look at her the way he had just looked at another woman, and because she hadn't dared direct that anger at anyone else in the room, she had chosen the most vulnerable person there. She said it was the most cowardly thing she had ever done in her life, and that she hadn't come to ask for forgiveness because she didn't believe she had the right to ask. Maren listened to everything. Then she looked up and said she wouldn't tell Celeste it was all right, because it wasn't all right at all, and if she said otherwise, she would only be lying to make both of them feel better. She said she didn't forgive her today. Then she continued, her voice softening slightly, saying that Celeste had done one thing right the night before, and she acknowledged that. Celeste nodded without trying to say anything else, and that was perhaps the 2nd right thing she had done in 24 hours. In the hallway on the other side, 3 men from the Castellano family were waiting for Rafe. The oldest among them said this matter didn't need to go through the courts. He said that in this city, when someone fired at the Castellano family in front of 300 guests, all 4 of the other families would be waiting to see what the Castellanos did, and if the answer was to file a lawsuit, people would take from it a meaning very different from the one Rafe wanted them to take. He said Rafe's father wouldn't have done that. Rafe listened to everything, then said his father had handled matters that way for 40 years, and the result was that 7 years earlier, a man had dared fire at Rafe's car on Bellwether Bridge, and then calmly sat across from him at dinner for the next 7 years, because he knew with certainty that the matter would be settled in a closed room with only 6 people aware of it. Rafe said he had turned over the entire file to federal prosecutors at 11 o'clock the night before. The scene report, the port route records, the notebooks, the ring, everything. The older man asked whether he knew what those files contained concerning his own family. Rafe said he did. He said he would have to testify, perhaps more than once, and that he had instructed his attorneys to begin preparing the previous afternoon. Then he fell silent for a moment and looked through the window into the room where Enzo lay. He said that for 11 years, he had believed the thing that kept a man alive in this city was how many people feared him. He said he had believed that until the night of February 14th, 7 years earlier. Power makes people bow their heads before you, he said. Only kindness makes someone dive into the water for you. The surgery took place on a Tuesday morning and lasted 5 hours, and close to 1 o'clock that afternoon, The doctor came out with the words Maren had waited 7 years to hear, that the hole had been completely repaired, and that from now on, Poppy's heart would only have to do the work it was meant to do. 3 weeks later, Poppy ran the entire length of the 4th-floor hallway. She truly ran, until she was out of breath, both arms stretched wide, and when she stopped at the far end and turned to look at her mother, her lips were still pink. Maren stood at the opposite end of the hallway, with one hand gripping the back of a chair, and it took her a while before she could make herself walk forward. 3 months after the night at the Castellano estate, everything in the city had rearranged itself in ways no one had foreseen. Weston Harrington appeared in federal court, and the trial would continue for some time. Rafe testified 3 times, each time with his attorneys beside him, and he didn't avoid a single question. Enzo Rinaldi learned to walk again with a cane, carrying a slight limp, and he still argued with his boss exactly as he had before. As for Maren Holloway, she didn't become anyone's wife. She applied for a scholarship intended for people returning to college after years away, wrote the essay herself over 3 nights after her daughter had gone to sleep, delivered the application herself, and didn't say a word to Rafe about it until the acceptance letter was in her hands. When he asked why she hadn't told him sooner, she said she wanted one thing in her life that she knew with certainty she had earned for herself. At 28, she returned to her 3rd year of nursing school, sitting in lecture halls beside students 7 years younger than she was, and she was the only person in the class who had ever held pressure on a wound for 7 minutes in front of 300 people. Every Tuesday morning, she drank coffee at the cafe across from the hospital before class. Rafe began appearing there one morning in April without an invitation, then returned the following week, and again the week after that, and neither of them gave it a name. They simply sat together for 40 minutes each week, talking about very ordinary things, and they both understood that some distances should only be closed very slowly. One afternoon, at the kitchen table in the 3rd-floor apartment, Poppy sat restringing her bracelet. She worked very slowly and seriously, arranging the colors in exactly their former order, and when she reached the final bead, she stopped and said one was missing, the first bead bearing the letter M. Rafe was standing in the kitchen doorway. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out the small object he had carried with him for the past 3 months, and placed it in the little girl's palm. Poppy looked at the plastic bead, then looked at him, then thanked him, and threaded it into place at the very end. When she had finished, she took the completed bracelet, slipped it around her mother's left wrist, directly above the old scar, and fastened it. There is one thing this story leaves behind. A person's worth doesn't lie in the uniform they wear, the car they drive, or the rooms they are permitted to enter. It lies in what they choose to do during those 3 seconds, when no one is requiring them to do anything at all. On the night of February 14th that year, all 12 people standing on Bellwether Bridge returned home safely. None of them got wet, none of them were injured, and none of them lost anything. But only one person was remembered, and she was the only one who had nothing in her hands except her own kindness. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so we know you stayed here with Maren until the very end. Share it with someone you believe needs to be reminded that kindness is never wasted. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can join us each day for more new stories. How did Maren's story make you feel? And if you had been one of the 12 people standing on that bridge that night, what do you think you would have done? Please leave us a comment, because we sincerely want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. We wish every one of you abundant health and a life filled with happiness and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.